I'm on the board for the Law Enforcement Action Partnership in the United States. I'm also chair for the organisation here in Europe. And we're a growing movement. We're an organisation which represents the growing movement of police and other law enforcement figures who are campaigning for an evidence-based drug policy. So we are former police and serving police, magistrates, prosecutors, various people from the criminal justice system who advocate for following the evidence, but also advocate for honesty. And as a police officer, I firmly believe that we not only have a duty to the evidence, but also a duty to the truth. And a problem that we have, and this is the position of the organisation, the problem that we have is that quite often, many of us who do this speaking is asked by someone in the audience, well, what you've said is very logical, what you've said makes sense, but why are the politicians not adopting it? And there's various answers to that, but I think the most important is that the public are constantly told that the current system works, and the people that are actually most guilty of reinforcing that belief is the police themselves. And I've done it myself when I've had a huge seizure, a huge success. We want to present to the public that what we've been tasked to do, we are doing, and we're doing it successfully. But the context needs to also be applied for the truth to be the truth. So I'll try and explain from some of my own experiences. But before I do, I should point out that our growing membership is huge, and I speak to our members all over the world. So some of the experiences that I'm going to explain to you, I have colleagues, former undercover cop, for example, in Baltimore. I have colleagues in Melbourne in Australia, Canada, France, Spain, and we all have similar experiences. So whereas on this bill you will hear from two of the best criminologists in Europe, and they study the evidence, we refer to the evidence in our organisation, but we also find that it's important that we explain our experiences, because it is our experiences that the public really need to hear, especially from the way that we understand it. So I got into undercover work by accident, really. I was quite a young cop. I'd only got 4 years in, but there was a huge moral panic going on in the United Kingdom about crack cocaine. And the reason we had this huge moral panic is because we'd had tabloid newspapers telling the public that as soon as the crack cocaine hit our streets, then it would be catastrophic, it would be a disaster. Because for years our tabloid newspapers had told lurid stories about what was happening in the United States. So at the moment we actually had our first crack cocaine, that was it. Everyone was whipped up into a frenzy of fear. And this created a classic feedback loop where media has excited the public, and then politicians listen to the fears of the public, and then you get political decisions. And the political decision was that the Home Office instructed all of the chief constables to make drugs the number one priority, above everything, above domestic violence or any other social concern. And that meant that there was an expansion on covert drugs policing, and that's where I stepped in. I got an attachment to the drug squad, and one of them looked at me one day and said, "Do you fancy having a go at buying some crack?" Which I thought was an unusual suggestion, but I was going for anything. And I went, and I was sent to this door and sent to knock on this door, and met this huge guy, and ended up buying some crack cocaine, and it was actually really easy. In fact, as I was walking away, he said, "You take care now, don't get yourself arrested," which I thought was quite considerate, really. But the point is, that first day, it was really easy. But of course it was. This kind of low-level undercover work hadn't happened in the UK before. He had no idea there might be a police officer knocking on his door asking for drugs. But of course, he went to prison, and he talked to a lot of people, and in no time at all, the new tactic was out there. And suddenly, the streets became much more dangerous for everybody, actually, but certainly for me. So I went from doing a few days operation at a time, then a few weeks, and in no time at all, I was doing no less than 6 or 7 months of undercover operation. I was being loaned out to all of the different drug squads around the country. I went as far north as Leeds, as far south as Brighton. I don't know if these cities mean anything to you, but lots of different places in the UK I was working undercover anyway. And it got more and more difficult with every passing year, which meant I had to develop my tactics, We had to develop the structures, the covert structures around what we did. And it became a very sophisticated and slick affair, really. And then I did one operation where, at the end of it, one of the vulnerable people I'd manipulated, and I should make it clear, whenever I went into a city, I looked for the most vulnerable people. Because the most vulnerable people living in squats or homeless, living on the fringes of society, they tended to be using the most drugs. But most importantly, from my point of view, is they were the easiest to manipulate, these vulnerable people. And if that sounds ruthless, well, of course it's ruthless. That is the nature of the work I was doing. But this one particular chap called Cami, I got really friendly with him. I really spent a lot of time with him. I spent time listening to his childhood trauma, how his father used to abuse him. And I remember him saying to me one day, "Yeah, my father used to beat me, but only when I deserved it." And that was the fabric of his emotional pain, really. The reason that he was personally using heroin and crack cocaine. I went shoplifting with him, which was great fun. It really was. But of course, I had my get-out-of-free jail card. I knew I wasn't going to prison for it. But at the end of that operation, when he was in police custody, along with the gangsters that he introduced me to, he ended up being on minute-to-minute watch, suicide watch, in the cells. And the reason for that is he thought I was his one friend in the world, the one person finally that he'd found someone to talk to about his childhood trauma. And this was too much for him. And so for a while I gave up undercover work because it was just too emotionally difficult. But then I was talked into doing another operation. And the way that this was sold to me was, they said, "Woodsy, we need you to come back. We need you to do this job because these gangsters, they're even more dangerous than the last lot. They're using sexual violence. They're gang raping people as part of their reputation building, as part of their sort of ruthless profile building." They were doing the usual kind of things, kidnappings, maimings, that kind of thing. One of them was implicated in 7 different murders in the city of Birmingham, and he was also the person who provided the machine guns for 2 very infamous murders of 2 young women that we'd had a few months before that. So I was myself manipulated into going back into the work. And I spent weeks manipulating the vulnerable population of the city in Northampton, and I got to know them. And eventually I got regularly buying larger and larger weights of heroin and crack off this gang. And every single day in their company I felt an immediate threat of violence, because that's the way they operated, that's the way they adapted and developed. And one day they stripped me. They told me, "You're a cop, you're 5-0 man, you're heat, strip, you're wearing a wire." And when I was going to object, one of them lifted up a t-shirt and showed me a gun tucked into the top of his tracksuit bottoms. And you know, the strangest things go through your head at times like that. Well, the strangest things go through my head at times like that. I remember looking at this gun and this tracksuit bottoms thinking, how on earth are those tracksuit bottoms holding up that gun? But it was made clear that I had to do as I was told, and it was a thoroughly humiliating experience. So I really learned to dislike that gang. I really did. So at the end of 7 months, when I realised that I'd gathered evidence against the 6 main gangsters of the gang called the Burger Bar Boys, it's a very British name for a gang, isn't it, the Burger Bar Boys, got the evidence against the 6 main gangs, but also 90 other people. 90 other people. So the runners, the sex workers that were working for them, people stashing, huge number of people. But the important thing from my perspective was I got no new phone numbers to get, no new names. I got evidence of conspiracy against most of them, but I got evidence against all of them. So I'm thinking, wow, this is just going to sweep the whole city clean. This is incredible. We're going to get everybody in one go. We had police brought in from 5 different counties around it, so we had hundreds and hundreds of cops involved in this operation. It was massive. And then when the dust settled afterwards, the intelligence officer dedicated to that operation spoke to me afterwards and says, "Yeah, we managed to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. 2 hours. 7 months of work, really genuinely believing I was going to die on multiple occasions, hundreds of police involved. The resources involved were just astronomical for the sake of interrupting that drug supply for 2 hours. Now, by this point in my undercover career, I'd had lots of doubts and about the efficacy, even the ethics of what I've been doing. But I've been pushing that aside because I was so wrapped up in this world of covert policing, and I had to believe in what I was doing in order to function successfully. But I couldn't ignore this at all. Now, I don't know for certain that it was the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, that they were generally at war with, who took up that opportunity that I created for them in that marketplace. I don't know. But you can sort of picture the scene. The rival gang are all sat round. One of them comes in the door and says, "Hey boys, put the call in. We're going to make a fortune." Guess what the cops have done for us? They've only gone and locked up the Burger Bar Boys. Wow. And that is actually how it is at every level of the drug market, whether it's at street level or whether it's regional. The police always create those opportunities. And it's important to note that police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. Really good at it. Doesn't matter what country you're in, if you give them twice the resources and instruct them to try and catch twice as many, they'll catch more. They will. But that's a significant part of the problem. Because wherever you create that gap, more often than not, you increase violence afterwards. Now, any police officer anywhere who has access to their own criminal intelligence database will know that quite often that happens. It varies by degrees in different countries. In Baltimore, it always causes more violence, every single time. But more often than not, on average, around the world, it does. It also increases consumption. In Switzerland, where they have a remarkable, brilliant health approach policy for heroin, which means they used to have a huge heroin problem, now they don't, because they legally regulated heroin and the government controls the supply. So they don't have a heroin problem anymore that they used to have. But in this progressive thinking, police felt like they were being criticised, and they wanted to prove that police activity can actually have an impact. And so the police in Bern, they commissioned a test of the sewage. And they wanted, because they had information that this one family was in charge of the whole methamphetamine supply. And it was all linked to one kingpin. And they thought, we can take out the whole market in one go, we can prove the impact. So they commissioned a test of the sewage water before and afterwards. No shock to me, but quite shocking to them, they found that consumption in the city of Bern went up afterwards. It went up. And that's because when the police so efficiently create a gap in the market, quite often it's fought over with violence for who takes control of that, but also, quite often, it's just about a price war. Now, in Finland, I know you have a very good alcohol policy. You don't allow supermarkets to do bog-off deals, buy one, get one free. Whereas in the UK, we have a far inferior alcohol policy to you, and our supermarkets can do that at Christmas. And having previously had a problematic relationship with alcohol, when I walk around my supermarkets in December and I see those deals, I'm thinking, oh, I should do that. I should buy 2 crates. Well, the same happens for methamphetamine when you have a price war. Because wherever you take out dealers, they always do 2-for-1 deals, and consumption goes up. The police are good at catching drug dealers, and that's a problem. Because whatever the police activity is, the size of the market never reduces. Now that's important. Now I know some people in an audience might be saying, well, no, that's demand reduction. But I purposely don't use the language that police use, because it's important to see this in a business sense. The market doesn't reduce. So if the police, with all this, like the operations that I did, with hundreds of cops involved and you're arresting all these people, if you're not reducing the size of the market, what are you doing? You're changing the shape of it. You're constantly changing the shape, but it's not an improvement, because organised crime constantly adapts. That's why the first time I bought crack on that on that doorstep, and he said, "You take care, don't be arrested." Very nice chap. It adapted very quickly. Organised crime always adapts. But there's a really key and important aspect of how they adapt that we also need to be paying attention to. Not just the fact that it means more people are dying. Not just the fact that harm reduction is more difficult because organised crime are in control. But also, and I'll tell you one of my personal experiences about this. In the operation with Cammy, he introduced me to this substantial gangster who interrogated me with a knife pressed into my groin, which is quite uncomfortable, quite off-putting, I can assure you. He sold me some crack, and then the next day, 2 of my backup team went off sick. And so I got introduced to 2 new police officers. The first one, I shook his hand, I had no problem with him. The second one, I shook his hand and the hairs just went up in the back of my neck. I knew this guy was wrong, instinctively. So I asked the person running the operation to exclude them because I didn't trust them, which he did. I put it out of my mind. 12 months later, when the gangster Colin Gunn, the head of the Bestwood cartel, got caught by very, very good operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it was found that that police officer I'd taken exception to was an employee of that gangster. He was part of his gang, and he'd paid to join the police. He was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. Now, in debriefs from that, senior cops said to me, "Well, we know this happens. Of course this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen?" But it's not just the value in the market which causes this corruption. You cannot entirely defend against that corruption because of the value in the drug markets. It's also the mechanism of policing. Because when you create those gaps in the market, not only do you cause disruption and violence and increase consumption, you also increase corruption. Because if you take out one drug gang, the one that's most able to take up that opportunity is another drug gang, and they expand their share of the market. If you expand your share of the market and you have more disposable income, organised crime will always invest it in corruption. Always. So that constant mechanism of policing, that changing shape of the drug market, is leading to and increasing corruption. And you can see this taking shape around the world. There used to be 20 cartels in Mexico. Now there's 3. Those 3 have incredible power of corruption. Transnational organised crime has in the last few years corrupted entire nation states. Many states in West Africa are now narco states. Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. You've got Honduras in Latin America. Narco states. This is being caused by prohibition and our attempts to police drugs through prohibition. And it's increasing. The Global Initiative into Transnational Organised Crime called transnational organised crime the single biggest threat to our security and our democratic way of life. And yet we're still fighting and still making it worse. And to top it all, we can't tackle the climate crisis without tackling drug prohibition. Because to tackle the climate crisis, we need good governance in all of the equatorial countries which control the jungles. Guinea has the fastest deforestation on earth at the moment. They're a narco state. They can sign a deforestation pledge, but it's meaningless because they do not control their own backyard. And we have done this, and we are doing this. So we need to change. We need legally controlled drugs. We need governments to take control. Thank you very much.
Maybe I would like to, I'm not sure if I should give this question to Neil or to Veronica. We have this discussion in Finland revolving a lot about the decriminalization of drugs, so basically taking away the punishment for using illegal drugs. But we have very little discussion around the idea of regulating drugs, and that's what our speakers here from the UK already brought up, that the solution, the real solution that we need is the regulation of drugs, not just decriminalizing the use. And maybe a question: how can we further that debate? And
Do you want me to?
yes, something. I don't really have a formulated question because this came so quickly, but this paradigm, decriminalization versus regulation.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and obviously the discussion certainly in this region has been much more about decriminalisation. Certainly in Norway, decriminalisation is the reform that almost passed, and hopefully we'll do again soon. And of course, decriminalisation is a really important step because criminalising young people only causes them harm. You ruin people's life chances for something that is normal human behaviour. This drug consumption is normal human behaviour, and the sooner we accept that, the sooner we can get some more sensible policies. So yeah, of course, stopping the criminalisation of anybody who uses drugs is a very, very important step. But we're LEAP, so I speak for LEAP, and I'm coming at this from a policing perspective. Yeah, I want to consider the welfare of our population, but I'm still fighting organised crime. And that's what I want to do. And you can't fight organised crime just by decriminalising. So yes, you can look at Portugal. They have saved lives. They have less bloodborne viruses. They have less petty crime from people who are being exploited by organised crime. But you've still got organised crime controlling the supply. You've still got organised crime refining their wealth and investing it in corruption. You've still got no control over the supply, which, making reference to what Anne-Marie said, Martha died because the MDMA was not regulated, and all of the MDMA deaths that I'm aware of, all of them, are because it's an unregulated product. It's either 4 or 5 times too much of a dose, or it's adulterated with something, with PMA. I saw a rather terrifying image of 4 different pills seized in Manchester in the UK a couple of days ago. 4 different pills, identical, 4 different compositions of drugs in those pills. One of them had MDMA, one of them had PMA in it, which is extremely much more dangerous than MDMA. 4 different, so literally a lottery, even when pills look exactly the same, and that's terrifying. And that's because criminals control the network. And it's important to note that regulation is coming. It is coming. Politicians everywhere need to just sit up and wake up that this is coming. And soon it will be like a tide. As soon as Germany gets their regulation of cannabis up and running, everything else is on the table. If you look at what's happening with the medical regulation or the impending medical regulation of psychedelics, people are already talking about the regulation of psychedelics for well-being, to prevent a decline into mental illness. This is coming. So we've come to Finland not to say that we know best. We've come to Finland in hope, because you made the point about being a leading light in human rights, but Finland's a leading light for social policy. You have Housing First, which is being copied everywhere. It's being copied in the UK. You do have this reputation for not only pragmatic, but really intelligent innovations in social policy here. You've got far better alcohol regulation than we do, than anywhere else in Europe. You've got these innovations. We're looking to you for leadership. That's why we've come here. But leadership has to involve how best to take control. And this is about control. Regulation is about control. There's another question.
I just want to add on here, because I think it's the most essential question of everyone that's going to be raised, the question about regulation. Because that's the basic thing I'm really talking about. When you have these discussions in Norway, and they get quite heated, because we always throw around a lot of different words around. One of the criticism of the proposal for Norwegian reform was that it was legalization. It was never meant as legalization. And if you call someone a legalist, then of course he has no sort of, then he's a bluff. Everyone will just think that this is going to go very wrong. But when it comes to regulation, basically, we already have regulations of drugs. They're called pharmacies. And I had them for a very long time. All things sold on pharmacies, all drugs sold on the street, you can also find in pharmacies. The big thing is that one is illegal, the other one is legal, actually. So there's different ways of doing this, to be very concrete. First of all, you can go the pharmacy way, which is old. We used to have that. If you go 100 years back, it was sold in pharmacies. You could get everything you wanted in pharmacies. So it all has to do with how you regulate it before that, if you have doctors in, and how you're going to do that practically. The other one, of course, is the good old Nordic way of having monopolies, like the alcohol monopoly in Norway and Finland and Sweden, which works well. Don't do like the US, have a free market. That's the most stupid thing you could do. The most stupid thing, of course, is what we're doing now. Try to use it as a penal question and using police and the court system. That's one we know isn't working. We know that it's not working and it costs a hell of a lot. So, what I'm saying, we already have models of regulation. We just have to choose them. What you want. You want to go for monopoly, or you want to go for a pharmacy, or whatever. It already exists.
Now we have one more question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Pekka Hakkarainen, research professor at the Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare. Just a short additional question to Neil. Just to be explicit what we are talking about. When you said that you see regulation as a solution for organized crime supplying drugs, then we are not talking about only cannabis. What is the main trend in the regulation and legalization policies? But all kinds of drugs, am I right?
Yeah, that's right. We advocate the legal control, the legal regulation of all of the drugs. And the drugs should be regulated according to their relative risks. So for those countries that have a problem with heroin, for example, heroin is actually easiest to regulate because you regulate it through a medical control, and we have very good examples of that. We used to do that in Britain up until the end of the 1960s. When we regulated heroin, it meant that if you had developed a problem with heroin, or cocaine actually at the time under the British system, you would go to a doctor, and if you had a problem, you would be provided a safe supply of that drug, which meant we didn't have any organised crime involvement at all. So at the end of the British system, in the end of the 1960s in the UK, we had 1,046 heroin consumers, and the number was falling. So then it was banned, then it was controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Less than 15 years later, we have 300,000 heroin consumers in the UK, and all of the associated organised crime violence that went with it. We surrendered control to organised crime. Now, some drugs are easier to regulate than others. I believe one of the easiest to regulate will be MDMA. Easier than cannabis, because you can't grow MDMA at home. You can only get it made in a pharmacy, and it will be the easiest drug to get rid of the illicit market, because who would buy something concocted in a back alley if you can get something regulated in a blister pack, certified as produced in a laboratory from a licensed pharmacy? The illicit market would disappear. Cannabis is one of the most trickiest to get rid of the illicit market. In Canada, they've made the mistake of pricing it at twice the price of the illicit market. Twice the price! Which means they've only got rid of 60% of the illicit market. But that's still a win. It's still a win because it's less money going into the pockets of organised crime. But psychedelics, whatever the drug, yeah, they all need controlling, all of them, according to their relative risks.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you for the answers. Just to give a short comment, I've been working for the past 6 years in the Tor web on the drug marketplaces here in Finland, like online drug marketplaces, and I can say that just installing one app you can get pretty much all the drugs 24/7 currently. So I would really like to see more control in the way drugs are sold, because now anyone, not depending on your age, can get any drug all the time, and I don't think that's a good model.